And one of my favorites from here in the Wiregrass area, which is where we all are, is the story of Bill Sketoe's Hole. Have you ever heard the story of Sketoe's Hole? Okay, how many of you know where Ozark is? You know where? Okay, Ozark is a town maybe 10 or 15 miles that way, and near Ozark is the little town of Newton. Okay, and Newton was a very prominent town 150 years ago. It's kind of faded over time. It's just a small community today. But back 150 years ago, there was a great war that swept across America called the Civil War. A lot of people in the South like to call it a variety of different names. The war between the states, the War of the Rebellion, the North called it. Everybody had different names for it, but mostly today people call it the Civil War. And most people think it was the South fighting the North, but in truth, many people in the South picked their side. They weren't all on the same side. And that was the way it was around here. There were a lot of people in the South who fought on the Union side, which was mostly the northern side. There were a lot of people in the South who fought on the Confederate side, which was mostly the southern side. And then you had some other people who just picked the side of their own, and that's the side that they fought on. And these people were called raiders. And they hid out in the swamps along the rivers, and they basically came out and they raided the communities and the farms and the houses, and just were robbers, and they took what they wanted from the people who lived in the area. And one of these groups was led by a man named Jim Ward, and his group was called Ward's Raiders. And they lived in the swamps on the Choctawhatchee River, which is over west of here. Well, the military of the Confederacy sent in a group of soldiers to try to find Jim Ward's raiders. And as they were doing that, they found a man coming out on a wagon, and his name was Bill Sketoe. And they decided that Bill Sketoe was carrying supplies in to Jim Ward's raiders. Now, whether he was or not is a whole nother matter that is still debated today. But they arrested him, they took him to Newton, and they put him on trial. The trial lasted about as long as I've been talking to you, and they convicted him. And they sentenced him to death by hanging. And they took him to a tree down by the river at Newton, and they put a rope around his neck, and they put him up in the back of a buggy, and they tied the rope over the tree, and they tied it to something on the other side, and they pulled the buggy out from under him, and they hanged him. Well, Bill Sketoe was a very tall man, and so when they hanged him, his feet were touching the ground. And every time his toes would touch, he would push himself back up so that the rope would loosen up around his neck and he wouldn't hang. And one of the soldiers that had him as a prisoner was on crutches from a wound he had received in the war. And he used those crutches to dig out a hole underneath Bill Sketoe's feet so that finally Bill Sketoe would hang and die. And that's what happened. And after he died, they took him back into Newton, and they put his body in front of the courthouse, and they said that this is an example to anyone else who helps the raiders. And they put him on display for 24 hours, and then they buried him at a cemetery near there. Well, that hole underneath that oak tree stayed there for 130 years. And anytime you tried to cover it up, you could take wood like this and try to cover it up. And if you leave for the night and come back, it would be cleaned out. You could fill it with straw or sticks and leave for the night and come back, and it would be cleaned out. People even tried to camp on top of it. They would cover it up, lay out their sleeping bag on top of it, and go to sleep. They'd get up the next morning, pull up their sleeping bag, and the hole would be cleaned out. And the legend that people around Newton told is that it was the ghost of Bill Sketoe swinging over that hole, and his feet were sweeping the hole clean. And the hole stayed there until the 1980s, when they had the big Choctawhatchee River floods that flooded the towns of Elba and a lot of the other towns in the area. And that's when the Alabama Department of Transportation got involved. And when DOT does something, they usually do it right. And the water was washing underneath this bridge where the hole was. And so they piled big granite boulders there. And even old Bill Sketoe's ghost was not enough to move those boulders out of the way. And so you can't see the hole anymore because there's boulders on top of it. But I believe that if we ever move those boulders, Sketoe's hole is still down there. And so that's the story of Bill Sketoe's ghost and Sketoe's hole. If you've ever looked up a book in your school library, or if you want to buy a book, look for a book called 13 Alabama Ghosts in Jeffrey. It's a very famous book by Catherine Tucker Wyndham. And there's a story in there called The Hole That Will Not Stay Filled. And that's one of the more famous stories that's in that book, and that's the story of Bill Sketoe. It's a good story. It's a reminder that no matter how bad we might think times can be, that sometimes they were a little worse than other times in our history.